And I call on Alison Johnstone to speak to and move the motion for 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We have just over 10 years to act to avoid climate catastrophe. That was the stark warning that emerged in October following the publication of the IPCC's special report on the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees. The report detailed some of the impacts we can expect to see if countries don't act to radically curb their greenhouse gas emissions. People losing their homes to rising seas, water scarcity, loss of coral reefs, plummeting biodiversity, and profound knock-on effects on the ecosystems upon which we base our societies and our livelihoods. Across the world, extreme weather events and erratic temperatures caused by climate change are becoming more and more frequent. In Scotland, we're beginning to see impacts too. Over the past year, we've seen a prolonged summer heatwave, as well as extremely high winter temperatures in February. The Link WWF report, Scotland's Nature on Red Alert, suggests impacts on our wildlife, including salmon populations affected by rising water temperatures, reduced snow cover, lowering populations of our iconic ptarmigan, and drier summers, reducing habitat for our wading bird species. I know this isn't easy to hear, but it's to make clear that the climate emergency is already on our doorstep, and it is the duty of everyone in this Parliament to support actions that will avoid a climate breakdown. The Green motion today commends the inspiring actions of our young people who have taken part in the global youth strike for climate movement. The strikes are inspired by the actions of 16-year-old climate activist Greta Thunberg and represent students from all over the UK taking direct action to ensure young people's voices are heard in the call for governments to address climate change. 2 strikes have been organised so far, and another is planned for the 12th of April. During the 15th of March strike, school walkouts were planned in 19 towns and cities across Scotland, as far apart as Peebles and Ullapool. We estimate that some 5,000 young people attended the 15 March protests held in Glasgow and Edinburgh alone, and they were acting in sync with school strikers in over 100 other countries, one of the largest mass youth movements we have seen in recent times. I and my colleague Andy Whiteman joined those strikers who stood outside this building 2 weeks ago. We listened to their concerns and what they wanted for their future: secure jobs, clean air, thriving environments, and security for their children. And I know that they would welcome more contact with those of us in this chamber, and I hope that those who are able to take the opportunity to join them for next month's strike. The UK Student Climate Network, one of the event organisers, describes its mission as radically reforming the role and power of young people in national action against climate change by employing strong and repeated student-led protests to promote diverse voices calling for a common aim. And it has 4 key demands, namely that governments declare a climate emergency and prioritise the protection of life on Earth, taking active steps to achieve climate justice, that the national curriculum is reformed to address the ecological crisis as an educational priority, and that officials communicate the severity of the ecological crisis and the necessity to act now to the general public, and that governments recognise that young people have the biggest stake in our future by incorporating youth views into policy making and by bringing the voting age down to 16. I note that both the Government and the Conservative amendments would water down this Parliament's support for the actions demanded by the youth climate strikers. Now, I fully support the strikers' aims and I stand in solidarity with them. It is unacceptable that our young people should have to sacrifice their school days to urge that the adults in charge do the right thing for people and planet. It has been the inaction of governments over the past 20 years that has brought them to this point, and we can't let it continue. We not only have a moral obligation to act in the best interests of young people and future generations, but also to deliver climate justice for less well-developed countries. Those countries in the Global South who've done little to contribute to levels of historic greenhouse gas emissions are bearing the brunt of climate disruption. Cyclone Idai is just the latest extreme weather event exacerbated by climate change to devastate communities across Mozambique, Malawi and Zimbabwe. And I think it's fair to say that Brexit may feel like a crisis here, but I don't think we're hearing enough of the devastating impact that that is having on people in those countries. The country's former First Lady, Grata Mikel, has said Beira, Mozambique, will go down in history as having been the first city to be completely devastated by climate change. Now, Scotland has taken the first steps in setting up a climate justice fund, and I recognise the Scottish Government's support for work to boost climate adaptation in Malawi and other African nations. It is needed more than ever at this point in time. There is more that can be done. The discussion around setting Scotland's new climate targets ought to consider the fair shares approach developed by Oxfam International. This approach recognises that as one of the first countries to industrialise, we've benefited historically from greater levels of wealth and technological development than many in the global south, and that this advantage caused associated greenhouse gas emissions. So I hope our historical contribution to the climate emergency will be reflected by this Parliament setting a net zero greenhouse gas target when the climate bill comes before the Chamber. Underlying the climate emergency is our global dependence on fossil fuels, which is hurling us towards a breaking point. We need to urgently move away from fossil fuels in our energy systems and in the choice of products we consume. Both the Scottish and UK governments favour a policy of maximum economic recovery of oil and gas reserves, extracting every drop we can. But at what cost? A 2015 report in the journal Nature advised that 1/3 of the world's oil reserves and half of its natural gas reserves must be off limits if we're to have any hope of meeting the temperature targets. Yes.
Stuart Stevenson.
Will the member accept that extracting oil and gas has no impact whatsoever on the climate? It's what you do with it after you've extracted it. And until we have found a substitute for the use of oil and gas in our chemical industries, we simply cannot throw away the economic opportunity that they provide.
Alison Johnstone.
The member will be aware that over 90% of the oil and gas that we currently extract is burned. Yes. I appreciate there are other uses for that. Thank the member for his intervention. But new forms of fossil fuels must also be kept in the ground. We believe Scotland needs an outright ban on fracking in primary legislation. It is frustrating that the Scottish Government is dragging its feet on setting out its preferred policy position. And I note Claudia Beamish's efforts in pursuing this outside of government too. Greens have fought fracking from the start, lodging the first parliamentary motion on the subject back in 2011, because it is a serious risk to people's health and local environments while driving up greenhouse gas emissions. I led the first full debate on fracking in this chamber back in 2014, 5 years ago. And after all of the arguments and pressure since then, I am disappointed that we've not moved forward in developing primary legislation to set a watertight ban on fracking in Scotland. The climate emergency will not be abated if we recklessly pursue this new source of greenhouse gas emissions. Every government must now consider a raft of policies to prevent a climate breakdown. This could include providing better buses and reliable rail options that are publicly funded and affordable. A green energy transition where our homes can be heated from renewable energy sources, divesting all public money from the fossil fuel industry, increasing the... yes?
Liam Kerr.
Following up on the intervention that was made earlier, how does the member propose to replace the £9.2 billion contributed to the economy and the 135,000 jobs in the offshore oil and gas industry through these proposals?
Alison Johnstone.
Yes, I can point the member towards the Green Jobs in the Economy report, which is based on sound research, which shows that 200,000 jobs could be created in a green jobs transition. So I'll certainly make sure that Mr Kerr has sight of that report. Yes. We need to be spending at least 10% of our transport budget on active travel. We need to place a levy on some single-use plastics. And we need to redirect government business support towards environmentally responsible companies. Presiding officer, small changes alone won't stop climate catastrophe. We must heed the warnings from the IPCC, the youth strikers and those on the front line of climate change across the world. I move the motion in Mark Ruskell's name.